Okay, so as mentioned, we will today expand our view from the Nordic or North European context. One of our speakers is Karen McIntyre. She's Associate Professor of Multimedia Journalism at Virginia Commonwealth University. And Karen has worked with the concept of constructive journalism and is one of the editors for the book Reporting Beyond the Problem: From Civic Journalism to Solutions Journalism that was published last year. And she will be talking about her work and all these different concepts that connote social responsibility, together with Laura Ahva, who is Associate Professor of Journalism Studies at Tampere University, Finland. And Laura did her PhD on public journalism back in 2010 and has studied these different forms of socially responsible journalism and journalism's relations to the public ever since. She has also developed the concept of conciliatory journalism here in Finland, together with myself and also several Finnish journalists. Some of them might even be in the audience today. So, okay, let's move on to the actual dialogue part. And to give the floor to you, Karen and Laura, let's start with a simple question. Could you both tell us how you have come to work with the concept of social responsibility? Was there a particular kind of social irresponsibility in journalism that you set out to tackle, or how was it? Maybe Karen, would you like to start?
Sure, happy to start. Nice to see you all. I see some familiar faces and some new faces. So thank you for inviting me here today. It's always good to get together with other people in this field and chat. So I look forward to hearing from all of you as well. So to answer that question, so how did I come to work with social responsibility? So if I should just back up further than that, I first came to work with constructive journalism. That was my first entry point into this realm. And that was while I was studying for my PhD. And I came across it randomly online, an article by Catherine Guildenstead, and I just blindly reached out to her and asked if we could chat about it because it caught my interest. And so we had back then a Skype conversation, and it was wonderful. And I ended up running with that, doing my dissertation on the topic, and have been studying ever since. So I first learned about constructive journalism, and then of course that opened my world to all these other journalisms that I now think fall under this umbrella of social responsibility. And the way I came to social responsibility is really mostly every article that I would write about constructive journalism or solutions journalism or these fields, I would find myself referencing the social responsibility theory of the press, in my papers. And so this seemed to be a common theme. And when I say the social responsibility theory, I mean this idea that journalists have an obligation to consider society's best interests in their newsmaking decisions. So this was, this kept coming up in all of the papers. And I just felt like these approaches to journalism were especially committed to this, to considering society's best interests. You can say all journalism should be socially responsible, but I think these approaches just seem extra committed to that goal. And then when I started working on the edited book that I did with Nicole Dahman and our several authors, we have a chapter with each approach. So, constructive, solutions, peace, slow, engage, all these journalisms. And so we needed to find a term to couch them all together. And so we, did a lot of talking and thinking about, well, what is it that all of these have in common? And so that's when we, landed on socially responsible. So we called all of these forms productive and socially responsible. And I can, maybe we'll talk a little bit later about what that means, but that's how I came to, work or think of these approaches as being socially responsible forms of journalism. And so then the second part of the question too was there a type of socially unresponsible journalism that was, that these forms combat? I mean, yes, definitely. I think that depends on the approach, the specific approach. So, things like constructive journalism are an antidote to the negativity bias in the news. Things like slow journalism are an antidote to the 24/7 news cycle. So, I mean, and solutions journalism and peace journalism, an antidote to the, conflict, and not just conflict, but like excessive and sometimes unnecessary conflict. So I think, yes, these approaches definitely were born in part to combat socially irresponsible journalism. I'll stop there. Laura, what do you, how did you come to this?
Yeah, so it was great to hear, Karen, your thoughts and your journey in a way. My story starts with public or civic journalism. As Mikko mentioned, I did my PhD project on forms of public journalism, as I called it, in Finland in the early 2000s. I already became across with the notion when I was doing my MA thesis, actually, and trying to understand like the longer roots of that thought in a way. And in that literature, of course, that literature guided me to the social responsibility framework already back then. And of course, at that stage, the irresponsibility part for public or civic journalism was this sort of a elite orientation, trying to then highlight the role that regular citizens could play in journalism. So that was sort of the framework and the context for that. And then I've also studied sort of when the public journalism emerged, it was still kind of an offline era, and then online emerged. And after that, I was studying participatory journalism that could in a way also fall under this umbrella. But actually, it has not discussed on those terms typically, even if then perhaps the irresponsibility part there would be the access idea of how to provide access for non-journalists also to collaborate in more fruitful ways with professional journalists in participatory journalism. And there I actually, while I was doing my postdoc study, and it had the title Participatory Journalism, I got to know Petter, who is here, because I spent 5 days at the Södra Sidan local newspaper in Stockholm, observing how they, in practice, actually, I also knowing that the roots were in public journalism, in your thinking and the way the local newspaper worked there, but then focusing on the participatory aspect of that work. And then this conciliatory journalism project, also kind of a evolution out of those thoughts, which then focused on this. Then the irresponsibility part there would be the sort of the conflict-prone issues, how they're dealt with, and trying to find support from conflict mediation or conciliation. And then the same story as with Carol, like what would bind these forms together? They are similar, they are neighboring forms or approaches in journalism. There are certain connections, but what would be the binding or the umbrella theory or framework? And also then starting this this forum. We were having debates on what could we, there is something here, but what could be the umbrella? What could we name this forum? Because we wanted to be open for various kinds of approaches. We didn't want to limit it to conciliatory journalism, even if that was the term we were using here in Finland. So therefore, trying to come up with this, or going actually back to the social responsibility theory that I was already somewhat familiar from the earlier days. So this is, does it sound familiar, Karen?
Absolutely.
You both seem to have had kind of the same idea that there are all these different forms that call themselves with different names, and now we need an umbrella to connect them. But how do you see the connection? Is there some kind of a hardcore? What is actually, is there some combining elements to all these other than just the general idea that journalism needs to somehow serve the best interest of the society? Or
I think that it's maybe helpful to look at what's not doing that, because you can think all journalism should be concerned about society, right? Yeah, ideally, but it's not. And so in reality, I think the other side of the scale is, maybe more market-oriented journalism, journalism that is more focused on making money than on, doing public good. And so when I say, these forms are more committed to upholding the social responsibility theory, I mean it, because a lot of journalism isn't that committed in practice to that goal. So I think there's that. And then like, what specific, what is that? Are there specific attributes, that make it socially responsible? Yes, I think there are some kind of key elements to social responsibility. For example, so I think one is covering news beyond the problem-based narrative. So, changing our mindset in terms of our news values. In Journalism 101 textbooks, we're taught that bad news is news, that conflict is a news value. And certainly conflict is a news value, but I think this idea that we need to view progress and development and collaboration, as equally newsworthy as conflict and destruction is, I think that is a key element of social responsibility. I think too, this idea of embracing complexity. I don't know how many of you have listened to Amanda Ripley's essay, Complicating the Narratives, but if you haven't, it's worth a read or a listen. And she talks a lot about how we should not be afraid to write stories that are complex and nuanced. We should embrace that. Journalists are taught to simplify information, and often I find that results too in this kind of has to be two sides to every story type of journalism, which isn't always accurate, or it paints the two sides as equal when maybe the two sides aren't equal. We saw this with things like climate change, where reporters would interview a scientist who talks about climate change, and then they'd interview a scientist who doesn't believe in climate change. And those are then kind of looked at as two equal sides, when in fact they're not. And we all know the vast majority of the scientific community, believes in climate change, and the other side is a minority. But when we present this kind of two sides journalism, it mistakenly, makes these two sides look even. So I think avoiding that and embracing complexity and understanding that audience members can handle the complexity, and they want the complexity because that's more accurate. I think that is something that is kind of a key principle of social responsibility. I think emphasizing the connection with and the collaboration with the community. So through things like participatory journalism, I think that is important. Like the correspondent has done, really allowing the audience to be more involved. I think journalists traditionally have done a really bad job, at least in the US, of knowing their audiences. And so I think that relationship being strengthened can be a part of it. Yeah, those are some things. I'm sure there are more, but yeah, Laura, what do you think?
Yeah, I could continue from here. Of course, recognizing all the points that you make about, but I would add like even more key elements based on basically reading literature from the 1940s onwards. When, well, okay, let me start from here. In like in recent research literature, of course, the story of social responsibility theory in a way often starts from the 1940s in the United States after the war. In a way, the critiques that were raised there, whether the press had become too irresponsible in a way in terms of propaganda and also in terms of the market orientation. So it's the idea starts from there. So there is this kind of a self-regulation phase, I would say, self-regulation phase of social responsibility thought, like whether the press should self-regulate it more in order to, of course, avoid also like state regulation. So there was this sort of this press the regulation phase. Then I think next phase was this kind of a press theory or press model phase, when the four theories of the press, the book sort of included social responsibility as one of their models in which journalism is practiced in various parts of the world. And then I think it has moved to become more of an ethical framework, the whole social responsibility thought. And now I think I would call it like a normative ethos, kind of spirit or a culture in which journalists try to make sense of the kind of goals or ideas or should be's in a way what they would want to do. So in a way, this is like a very quick recap of how I find in literature how socially responsible journalism is addressed. And there I could then highlight some of these key elements. So that would be contextualization, like contextual truth telling in a way. So it has to be truthful, but it has to be placed in context. Then access to information and also access to action in a way should be provided for the public. Then also journalism that's socially responsible should be supportive of dialogue, but also critique in a way. And of course that dialogue can bring out critique. And then this all sort of then should be also acknowledged the perspective of human dignity. So these were the kind of the key elements that I found from literature in the work that I've done. So I would add those sort of elements, and based on this tradition.
So I have a question, but I think Catherine has a question. Did you raise your hand in the chat?
Yeah, please join us.
It's just
Okay.
Okay.
Usually you'd raise your hand in the, in the video, but okay, thanks. So I have a question. So Laura, if you had to define social responsibility and just in this context in one sentence, how would you define it?
I would define it as a sort of a normative ethos in sort of in journalism culture that underlines this contextuality, access, dialogue, human dignity, Therefore, it's kind of because it's an ethos. It's a way of like, it's just kind of a spirit trying to. So then it's not a code. It's not a code book in a way, like code of ethics. It's not an ethical framework in that sense. So therefore, this kind of ethos idea. Can you follow me here?
Yeah, I like it. I like your quote. It's kind of a spirit. Because I agree. It's hard. It's hard to define, and I feel like a lot of us kind of have like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about, but then when you're doing research on it, you have to define it, and especially if you want to measure it, and so it can become complicated to define it. So that's why I asked you, and I guess since I asked you, I'll be fair and answer the question myself, although I'm cheating because I had already written how I would define it, but and I put you on the spot. But so the way that we defined it in the book, so we said that we think these forums are productive and socially responsible. So we said by productive, we mean practices that push the conversation forward, that engage and empower audiences, and that seek to create meaningful impact. And then we said by socially responsible, we mean journalism that considers society's best interests by covering the news beyond the problem-based narrative, by reporting with depth and embracing complexity, and by emphasizing connection and collaboration with the community. So yeah, I guess we both did a good job of defining it by incorporating all the things that we had talked about in more lengthy ways.
I think there are two ways we can do it in a way. We can study the forms that are around us in a way, like all these journalisms that somehow are connected by, and then trying to figure out what the key elements or the core elements of socially responsible journalism from there, or then we can look at the sort of the history of the thought of that idea. And I have to say that I have been a bit troubled about this sort of, I don't think social responsibility has been that trendy framework in journalism studies at all. And I think it has sort of got stuck in the sort of the Hutchins Commission, more a storyline than an actual theory. And then also the 4 theories of the press book also did some harm to the thought in a way, because then it has been debated, the entire book has been very influential because it had the, what was it, liberal, social responsibility, authoritarian, and Soviet press models in a way, trying to, even if they were more of sort of empirical summaries of various surroundings where journalism was practiced, but then social responsibility was named as one. So in a way that sort of, in my view, made some harm to the notion. And I think in much research, I think we're still stuck with those two meanings or that legacy. Therefore, I think that the current forms that we have been discussing all along in this forum, and what Karen, you have been working with, and myself as well, we could bring, and we should bring, elements from the current forms to enrich the theory of social responsibility, to update it because it's still, so that it doesn't seem that outdated, and make it in a way, it's not naive. It's even if it's not trendy, I think we should, as researchers, because here we talk as researchers. I know we have journalists among the audience as well, but as researchers, we should, in my view, try to strengthen that framework.
I'm sure that people also in the audience may have questions and comments. You can post them on the chat, or you can find the raise hand thing behind the reactions button there, if you want to add to something that Karen and Laura are saying. But I was thinking, listening to you too, and I was kind of fascinated when Karen mentioned that the point of the opposite being market oriented and this being like socially oriented. I recognize that we probably haven't used that term so openly in our conciliatory journalism project, or kind of defined it as market-oriented, but I started thinking about the actual journalists who come to our workshops. And I know that you both have worked with numerous journalists who have kind of adopted these terms somehow or used these methods. So what do you think, what kind of journalists find this responsibility discussion or these two tools most useful? Do you think you can find a kind of a common ground thinking about the people who actually are enthusiastic about these things?
So I actually did, along with some colleagues, a national survey in the US of journalists. And it was, a big survey. It was representative of all newspaper journalists in the US. And we specifically asked them about their thoughts on constructive journalism, on solutions journalism, and we presented some of the values that we think are inherent in these socially responsible forms, like when you list journalistic roles, we added contextual roles. Like, is it important? Do you find it important to contribute to society's well-being and to accurately portray the world and to report on solutions and to inform the public not only of threats, but also of opportunities? And so we asked journalists in the US about this, and we found that younger journalists and female journalists were the most supportive of this type of journalism. So I think that's interesting. And I've also, will just say, in my own work, I find that I teach a solutions journalism class, and I find that the young people in my classes, a lot of Gen Z and millennials, are quite supportive of it. And I find that generation to be especially social justice oriented. And I think there are some similarities, between these contextual forms and having this kind of orientation towards social justice. So yeah, so young journalists, female journalists are ones that I've seen both in research and in my teaching that have been the most on board. What do you think, Laura?
I don't have a survey to back up my hunch, but I would say from my experience that journalists who are sort of searching some sort of a renewal of their spirit, if I come back to the idea of the spirit, in a way, like perhaps even lost somewhat of what being a journalist is about for them, and especially having this conflict with their professional identity and their work reality, having to do everything in 24/7 and knowing how good journalism could be done, but not perhaps having counter arguments for the bosses, or not having tools to start working. So in a way, therefore, I think journalists who sort of do some kind of soul searching. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I completely agree. Jaded journalists, for sure. I've had people tell me, I was ready to quit journalism, and then I came across, Solutions Journalism Network or something, and now I'm renewed. So I completely agree with that.
But I have one group who are not interested in what we discuss here, and that's like hardcore political journalists. In my experience, it's there it's more about like really or like hardcore investigative journalists either, even if that would, I think, be a kind of a fit. But therefore that's following the day-to-day game of politics in a way. There I think that we've faced most criticism from like that cohort of journalists.
I agree. And I find that journalists who have been working in the industry for a long time are the most hesitant. which makes sense. It's ingrained in them that, that conflict is news, and that, bad news is news. And it makes sense because we are asking them to kind of flip their mindset. And so what I found is that the people who are critical usually have not taken the time to actually understand what these approaches are. I find that the hesitancy is just right upon hearing the name, constructivism, right? And so the journalists who I know who started out against it and then actually took the time to understand what it is became on board. So I think that most of the people who are critical just actually don't maybe have a different idea or don't fully understand what we're talking about.
Yeah. No, we can come back to the question of these names in a way, like I think they are triggers for so many, in a way, like in Finnish conciliatory journalism is sovittelujournalism, and sovittelu, like conciliation, it really triggers some people. But also I think, and I have had my troubles with these names. So in a way, like this, why do you like, this sea of various journalisms and all the names, and therefore I think also the social responsibility framework is somewhat sort of a relief for me, that I can address these forms without getting stuck to the particular names of the approaches in a way. And I think that could also be beneficial in regard to how we communicate with the profession in a way, not necessarily underlining those names. I don't know, of course those are selling points as well, which makes it complex, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll always remember at the first conference fully dedicated to constructive journalism, I think it was December of 2016. Catherine can correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe anyone else can, but I remember someone gave a presentation about how constructive journalism has a PR problem, and that it's exactly what you say, Laura, that name is triggering. You hear that, and if you're a traditional journalist, you cringe. And so that stuck with me, that presentation. I think that's right. It's been a real struggle to come up with a term for these approaches that doesn't sound too positive. And I think, this idea that we shouldn't even have a name for it. And, constructive journalism is just good journalism. Yeah, that would be great. I think the problem is, as a researcher, you need to be able to define a term in order to measure it and study it. I mean, how am I supposed to do an experiment testing the effects of constructive journalism if I can't define what it is? So I think having the name helps researchers write about it. And then I think also having names does help us, even if maybe hurts us sometimes, with the awareness and with talking about it. If we all just walked around saying we should just do better journalism, but we didn't have a framework for talking about it, then we wouldn't get as much interest. So, but it's a hard one, because I do think the names do create some backlash too.
There is a question on the chat from Joy saying that, is socially responsible journalism more of an ideal or an aspiration rather than a framework that can be practically achieved in daily news reporting, granted, for example, the political economy factor? And I think that this, you talked about that they are the jaded journalists who are most welcoming to these new concepts or tools of socially responsible journalism. And I think that this kind of has to do with this dilemma of, is this rather an ideal, that they like this ideal? Like you said, Karen, we also in Finland have had people joining our workshops saying that I was just about to quit as a journalist, but now I heard about this conciliatory journalism and now I'm interested again. So there is this aspiration towards better journalism. But then again, if you would just call it workshop for better journalism, it would be like I've kept saying that if we had a research project just for better journalism, we probably didn't get the funding, but we called it conciliatory journalism, and suddenly everyone's interested to hear what that might mean. So there is, I think that there's, yeah, it's both the kind of the tools aspect that we need to find the tools to actually make it work in the daily news reporting. But it's also very important that there is this ideal element in it, because it leaves it open enough for people to kind of turn towards.
Yeah. My response to Joyce's question in a way would be like, I think it's an ideal aspiration in a way, and it's a normative way of thinking in a way. Normative in a way that it includes these ideas of we should do this and we should do that in a way, or aspire to something, and that can then structure the everyday work. But it's not necessarily that, you know, okay, that will function perfectly, but it's kind of a goal that can then turn into practices the best they can in a way. So this is how I think about it.
I agree. That's a great question, Joy. I think in some ways, maybe it's similar to a concept like objectivity, where it's an aspiration. So yeah, I would agree. Maybe socially responsible is more of this ideal or aspiration. And then maybe some of the specific approaches under that umbrella can be more of the frameworks that can be practically achieved.
Yeah, and then those approaches can then talk back to the theory, and then we can re-theorize socially responsible journalism as researchers.
Also, Elina posted a question. Do you want to read it out yourself? Should I? It's a great question, by the way.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm also a researcher in Tampere, and I've been mainly fangirling Mikko's and Laura's conciliatory project. My own research is about mistrusting audiences, and that's why I'm also interested in this kind of a topic. And I would like to know how this concept of social responsibility, how we understand it in journalism, is outlined. If we compare it, how it's defined in other in the industries, where it's very often used, and it's linked to ethics. And I've been reading, for example, definitions like the industry or companies should be aware of the consequences of its actions and minimize all the negative side effects and promote the common goods in society and so on. If I understood you right, Laura, you said earlier that it's not so much about ethics, but something else. It's not about ethics. What is it?
Yeah. Okay. Good one. I was unclear. It's rather, I think that there was a sort of a phase in the way in which social responsibility was understood, and one phase was like that it was particularly about ethics compared to the sort of the press regulation and the press theory phases in a way. So it has moved from this framework to be more of an ethical idea, and then this ethical idea in my thinking is included in this normative ethos that I that I talk about. So of course it's a kind of an ethical component there, so it's about ethics. But that's a great question in how, like in Finnish we talk about yhteiskuntavastuu, like social responsibility. Yeah, so it's, and that's everywhere now, how the companies are or should be socially responsible, and that would be a fun project to try to compare and contrast the various industries, how they use the notion in their, of course, like also kind of promotional perspective. I don't have an answer to whether, you know, how does it differ, but I would assume that the dimension of journalism being about publicness, the public sphere, constructing it in a way. I think that might make a difference.
But
yeah, I think it directly applies. It makes me think of in advertising. I don't know if you've heard of enlightened brands, but it's kind of the same idea that you should care about society and, you know, doing good for the world, not just care about making money with your product that you're advertising. And yeah, I think the concept of social responsibility in journalism compares pretty directly to this link to ethics, and that's used in other industries.
I agree that it has a direct link on that ethical level, but then again, with different industries, we tend to talk about like how to make it more environment friendly or something like that, and we don't kind of discuss that aspect of journalism too much. At least not in this forum. We haven't talked about the like the climate change effects of journalism so far too much. But we have discussed climate change in the journalistic projects that we have been running. Actually, there is a question first from Torbjörn. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I really do like the work being done trying to evolve journalism that is so for the better good of society and for readers and citizens. I was myself into public journalism, studying that and liking that. And since I started in investigative journalism, I try to combine investigative journalism and public. I thought that the methods of investigative journalism were great, but the way to choose subjects would be in greater participation with audiences and citizens. But since then, I have become a media scholar, since I was a journalist before. And I was working at a paper dealing with media criticism coming in. It was a industry magazine. And I wondered, where can I find the guidance how to solve this criticism? And then I got to the Hutchins Commission and so forth. And then I studied that more and more and sort of left the notion of social responsibility behind, because I found that in the Hutchins Commission's discussions, they wanted to change much things that were bad in the American press at the time, but they couldn't find a way to do that. They wanted to say that the media should be accountable, that one should say you have to answer to somebody, but they couldn't find a way to get unanimity about that. And instead they choose the rather more vague notion of a free and responsible press. There was a discussion about a free and accountable press, but in my research I took that lead sort of and tried to find out, but how could you make it more accountable? I mean, really, from different parts of societies and having demands on, and how can you facilitate that and so on. And besides that, I think that even I like the work done in all these sectors, constructive, conciliatory, dialogue, and so on. I think that the term social responsibility in journalism is, for me, it'd be a bit dated. I think reading this little book about, it was sort of a sequel to the four theories of the press, the normative theories of the media by Carl Nordenstreng and Clifford Christians and so on. They have a chapter on four different, yes, there we have it. In their chapter, they discuss this era of social responsibility from about 1800 to 1970, for some reason 1970. But they put it together to a bigger historical evolution of market society going amok, and you have to sort of rein it in. And then the social responsibility, not just in media, but in other lines of work as well. And then they see that participatory journalism is a new idea coming after, because of much critique was directed toward the notion of social responsibility. It didn't mean anything. The owners, the elite could carry on and say they were responsible, but there were no way to hold them to account. So therefore, for me at least, going back to calling yourself socially responsible, that means a wholly new sort of definition of the term, and sort of clean out the historical garbage of that defensive way that it was used by the owners and by the media conglomerates. Thank you.
Excellent points. I have personally also come across of these sort of criticisms in a way that, you know, this idea of social responsibility was just, you know, adapted to a situation in a way to also to avoid regulation much harder in a way, and also like I've heard these arguments that it's an outdated notion in a way, because, and also I happen to see Peter's questions: is the idea of social responsibility controversial at all? Does it trigger opposition? So in a way, like, maybe it's too accepted to be the way it has been used to be truly critical in a way, or truly normative. But my answer to this in a way, or like what I have been trying to think about this, is to sort of update the theory with new ingredients, to try and see whether it would make sense in the current context. But maybe it has too much baggage, I don't know. But of course, those criticisms has to be accounted for.
Mm.
Karen, do you have?
We
have questions as well. Yeah.
I see a new paper coming for sure. Reimagining social responsibility in the modern era.
Yes, and I was actually also there. Now we have a good lineup of questions coming up. But I was just thinking about the idea that the social responsibility was evoked kind of against the regulation, to avoid harder regulation, and that again kind of rings the bell with what Elina just said about the other industries, that we talk about greenwashing, and companies want to sell themselves as socially responsible to avoid actual accountability, I think, to some extent. So actually there was the first question was from Luis, which is very up-to-date question. Luis, do you want to ask it yourself?
Sure, why not? Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the space to ask my question. So it's about, as you can see, maybe you can read, it's about the current issue of Finland. And I think it's a good place to be, like if Finland and Sweden joining the NATO, and I would say the lack of the debate, not luck. I wrote luck, but it's lack, I guess, of debate and discussion. And I didn't have the time, you know, because I'm too much into this. I didn't have the time to think on how a good journalist could be. But my question is more about how would we deal with this in a perfect world, if you know what I mean, and not because you said, Karen, that it's very, like, news are very conflict oriented and so on, which I agree. But in this specific issue, I would say it hasn't been the conflict oriented. It's been like more like going with the power, if you know what I mean. The journalism's very more like, okay, so the power is saying this, we're gonna go with them, and no conflict and no debate. So it's like, it's even more conservative, if you know what I mean, or reactionary maybe even. So yeah, so this is something like that I would like to hear from you. Cheers, thank you.
A tough one, but a current one, I would say. I could perhaps just add that, you know, how you describe, I guess, the Swedish situation sounds pretty much what it has been in Finland as well. So in a way, I think acting out of gut feeling, gut feeling here, I think the politicians as well as journalists. So I think there has been plenty of this past trauma that has affected the way in which the whole NATO thing has been discussed in Finland. And I guess in the perfect world, this kind of combination of dialogue that would open up a space for critique or diversity of voices would have been the answer. But due to this kind of trauma and kind of a panic and quite effective and emotional, we can imagine all this sort of repertoire of discussion that this has opened up in Finland with having our trauma with the war in the Second World War with Russia. So aspects of dialogue and critique, peace, missing.
Being an outsider, I think you all can probably respond, with more insight than I can. So I'll defer to everyone else on this question.
That sounds like another paper, basically. So, like examining the NATO debate from the perspective of all these journalism approaches or social responsibility aspect.
I'm sure
I
there will
don't
be.
want to do the analysis. I think it's beyond me, but there is a possibility.
There has been previous research also on the Finnish NATO debates, so I'm sure there will be a lot of more to come.
There will be.
And now we are probably still too much in the middle, so Karen's outsider perspective might actually be better perspective to analyze what's going on in the Nordic countries right now. But now, John, you also have a question. Would you like to share it with us?
Thank you, Karen and Laura. I think this is very interesting, and I'm trying to get my confused thoughts together here. But I see a problem between what I really like to study. I'm interested in public service media surviving among the platforms, and platformization changing sort of the media logic and making it more difficult for small newspapers to survive, which means clickbaits become more common. And then the whole logic of how the commercial media works is also influencing now in Finland the public service media. So even Yle is beginning to act as if it was commercially responsibility and talking about customers instead of viewers and citizens, etc. So I find these utopias, even maybe not even utopias, but these new ideas like the public service internet initiative that came up, that there has to be something beyond this, and you have to counteract the powers of the platforms. Really interesting. And I would really love to hear more about this enlightenment brands idea. I mean, Luomo is a big thing in Finland, buying ecological stuff. In a time where bad news travel really fast and the fastest news bring the most money, but do you still see, Karen and Laura, that sort of this ecological label of quality, long, slow journalism could win some more ground if it just became more met? I don't know. How do you, where does the money come from, I guess is my question, to make this work? Sorry, I'm a bit confused.
Oh, another hard one.
Yeah.
Where's the money in social responsibility?
Is there? I mean, I guess for food, etc., and even consuming whatever you consume, especially today with global warming, etc., it's something top of mind thing for many young people today. So I guess the same thing could be implemented also for journalistic practices. But how?
I can go first if you want. Yeah, I mean, if I could answer that question, I'd be rich. So I don't know. It's hard to know where. Yeah, it's a hard question. But what I can say is certainly I feel like every new business model attempt is putting more focus on connecting with citizens, like with membership models. And so, I think we'd do a better job making money with social responsibility journalism if we really build better relationships with our audiences. And what the research has shown on socially responsible journalism being financially responsible too has been fairly encouraging. I've done some studies and read some other studies that have looked at like if you present a solution-oriented story or a conflict-oriented story on your website, and that have found that people are clicking more on the solution-oriented stories, and they're spending more time on the page reading those stories, more likely to like talk about those stories on social media. And so there has been, some promising research to show that this kind of journalism is in demand and could be financially beneficial. But we're certainly in the early stages of measuring that. So more needs to be done, but I wish someone would come up with an excellent business model to make this successful. I don't know. That's all I can add for that question.
Thank you. And also with the added amount of disinformation today, it seems that the traditional journalistic roles aren't enough, that there needs to be some forces working, slow work, finding the truth behind disinformation. So I think the field is changing.
I myself would want to believe in this idea that the sort of journalistically in a very trustful manner and well moderated, a good community in a way, a news outlet could create that sort of community and an environment would also be financially beneficial. It would be inviting for people who are surrounded by all this disinformation and flow of news, and in a way curated like a safe haven. I think there could be something in it when things online are getting crazier and crazier, and that would include moderation. I mean, online moderation of discussions, fact checking, all that, and that people might be ready to pay for that kind of service.
Yes.
I hope. But also what has been indicated now that the audience metrics in newspapers that are having paywalls, so they are measuring not just clicks, but also like subscriptions, whether a click creates a person to make a subscribe to that paper, pay something. So, and those indicate that it's actually the slower, longer stories that cause that also make people subscribe and pay. So that's one option or one glimpse of hope as well.
Thank you, Laura.
How about Catherine? Now you have the raised hand.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this great discussion. I was just making some notes during this discussion, so it's more like a comment, and maybe I'll end with a question. But around the name social responsibility, I think it's a highly evolved label that I understand, and researchers, smart researchers on this call understand, but many of my colleagues in journalism don't. They see it as a problem, because then they think that they should have this concept as some heavy burden in whatever they're doing, and can they not move freely in researching things and asking, interviewing sources and so on. What does it really mean if they were to apply the concept of social responsibility? But in my work, I've just stopped at saying, well, start to reflect on it. Just acknowledge that journalism has a effect on society, and then ask yourself, do you accurately portray the world? And if not, what could you be adding to that narrative? So I start very personally with their own reflection. And most journalists that I've encountered or had any conversation with around this get it when we argue along professional lines, like how accurately are you portraying the world? Because that's the norm that the majority of journalists would want to adhere to. And when they start to realize that they don't do that, you'll see that they will try to expand how they cover things to also add maybe a solution or depolarizing question or interviewing, something like that. So that's how I've started to work on it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you are right that the idea of do we portray the world accurately is probably kind of easier to sell in the newsrooms than are we socially responsible. Now, Petter, do you want to pick up on the question or the comment in the chat or something else?
Yeah, hello everyone. It's a great discussion. I'll see if I can add a comment about how to make this work economically for newspapers. What is the actual good that we talk about? We talk about it as journalism that aims to promote public good, and in what way is who is interested in paying for the public good? Is it only, I mean, in the Nordic countries at least, we have strong public service media, but I know for a fact that, I mean, even smaller regional newspapers in Sweden, they try to get a hold of this sort of this value that they feel is sort of slipping through the fingers of local community. How can you use your newspaper as a promoter of values and goods that probably a large majority of the inhabitants really want? I mean, they cherish them, they wish they were there. Things like social trust, civicness, especially in a quickly changing and evolving world, where things that seemed stable and predictable 20 years ago don't feel that way any longer. Then there is a very, very clear, I'd say, demand for this kind of social good. But the question is, how do you get in contact? How do you turn this into a value that people actually recognize as a thing that you need to pay for, or that this is something that can actually be delivered by the local media outlet in a way that you are prepared to pay for it as well. I think that is the challenge. But I think when I myself started to work with these things in the 90s, it was called public journalism, but also civic journalism, and the idea of civicness or civility was, I think, the value that the whole thing aimed towards. And I always in Swedish called it medborgarjournalistik, which is civic journalism in a way, because it is the civicness that is the goal of the whole thing. And that has, in a way, and that I'd say, I mean, emphasizing this, I think, is a good way of also marketing it. You talked about the PR problem. I mean, it has to be sold to the public as well. And if you call it social responsible journalism, then the focus is a lot of so are the journalists doing their stuff in a responsible way? But the idea of, if you talk about it as trying to strengthen these values, these goods that are out, among the audience, then you can make it a bit clearer for also audiences why this is a thing, a good that they will have to, they will want to support, and they might even want to pay for it. These were thoughts that came up in my head while listening to you. Do any of you want to comment or take this further? What do you think?
So I guess to me, it seems like the question is really, how do we make socially responsible journalism something that people want to pay for? Yeah. Right. I do think that people can relate to the idea that they are they are over it with with traditional news. Like when you ask people, you know, if how it makes them feel to read or watch or listen to the news, the answers that I always get are, you know, depressed, hopeless, anxious, stressed. And so maybe trying to capitalize on that feeling, like, hey, you know, if this is how you feel when you listen to the news, we're doing it differently, and we're going to make you feel empowered and, you know, and more informed and hopeful or something, more engaged, maybe trying to draw on that. But I mean, admittedly, the answer is beyond me.
Yeah.
I just recently heard, okay, now I have a 4-year-old assistant with me, but I just recently heard of this local newspaper. I know Peter comes from this context of local news publishing. Actually, in a city or town where Mikko lives, here near Tampere, that they actually made the whole sort of renewed their whole newspaper concept with these thoughts in mind. They perhaps did not call it social responsibility. They had all the strategies. They had business Finland involved, but they had also the idea of conciliatory journalism involved. So they restructured their whole brand in a way, and I guess they are seeing some sort of possibility for revenue there as well. So sorry, I'll mute myself for a second.
And I think also one way of looking at it is we talked about what kind of journalists turn to these kind of forms and concepts, but we haven't kind of maybe separated the audiences, that what could be the actual target audiences, specific audiences that would benefit. We tend to talk about the audience as the entire public when we talk about serving the common good or something, but maybe there are specific target audiences that would benefit from these approaches. Or how do you see this?
If someone asked me, I was distracted due to my son appearing.
Yes, I was just asking about the audiences, the specific target audiences that can you imagine like more specific target audiences of these kind of journalisms than just general citizens and the people?
These are still large groups of audiences, but based on those survey results that we found, maybe women or maybe younger journalists. Also, I don't know if you all have heard of solidarity journalism, but that's another one of these approaches. And that talks about how to report on marginalized communities in better ways. And so maybe certain marginalized communities would be one kind of more niche group.
So jaded journalists and jaded citizens.
Can I, you mentioned, Karen, that also in addition to younger people and younger journalists and female journalists, also journalists interested in social justice. And I think that, I mean, that's both a strength, but also sort of could be a problem with this kind of journalism, is that it maybe appeals also to audiences who are I mean, politically minded towards social justice, aka leftist in some way or another. They are not happy with the way things are in society, and they want to change it. And in this sense, the journalism, these kinds of journalisms are probably interpreted by everybody else as a bit activist activistic and radical in a political sense, because it obviously wants to do something. It wants to change something, and maybe I think that's also the same thing within the journalism professional core. Is that, I mean, of course, I mean, journalists who are happy with business as usual, they're not drawn into this. So it's always some kind of feeling of discontent or a kind of radicalism that is necessary to be interested in these things, and that goes as well also in the audience. So it's very clear. For instance, I mean, last evening I was out having a seminar with teenagers in one of the socially unprivileged parts of Stockholm, trying to figure out their thoughts and takes on how journalism should develop. And of course, from their perspective, it's very, very clear what has to be changed. They want social justice, and they want journalists to be advocates of this. So that could be also a thing that we need to discuss. How do we separate? Do we need to separate ourselves from the sort of the political agenda of social justice, and how does that affect and how does that relate to these ethical or ethos aspects that you both have mentioned? What do you think about that?
I agree completely. It's a challenge. I see this especially when I teach solutions journalism to students, and I have more trouble than ever with them putting their opinion in their stories. And, you know, every rookie journalism student, you know, struggles with objectivity. But when I'm teaching solutions journalism, I find that to be more of a problem. And so I struggle with, should we not teach these forms to intro level journalism students and wait till they're, you know, in their last year or something of studying? Or, you know, does it make sense to make them aware of these approaches from the beginning? But I do see that blurry line of, you know, subjectivity and advocacy. It does get blurrier when you teach this topic to social justice oriented journalism students.
We have actually also on the chat, Catherine has been asking about the kind of the future trends, I suppose, or what's next in the line of research. What kind of research do we have coming up related to the issue? You can answer this, Karen and Laura, later, but now we also have about 10 minutes left and we have 2 raised hands. So first, maybe Luis, go ahead.
If the other person hasn't talked, please give him or her the word.
You have both also had a turn, so you can go first.
That's typical. Okay, I'm just gonna. I think the discussion went further. It's really interesting what Peter and Karen was saying for myself to hear. But I was just thinking in terms of how to make it profitable and stuff like that. But I'm just thinking from Swedish perspective. Like we have the public service, like the public broadcasting, radio and television and so on. It's financed by the people. So we don't actually have that problem we wouldn't have the problem to have more constructive or whatever journals we're talking about because they don't need to go to look for like audiences in the same way, and they actually even have what do you call it, like from the government or from the politicians, they should actually talk with everybody and should be engaged in all of the audience and especially I would say marginalized groups. So for me, it's kind of why are they not doing this then? Because they don't have to go for the money, if you know what I mean. It's like a question that raises, because I know I've worked in that area before. And I was frustrated when I was there many years ago. And I guess I see Cecilia is here, like my former boss and colleague. And I'm just thinking, if we do have the public service in Sweden, why aren't they working like that? So that's a question that I have. Thank you.
Do you want to reply, Karen, Laura?
Does Cecilia have the answer? I don't know. I mean, are they being rewarded for?
Look, Louise, that's a great and very important question. It's not about money, but still it's about, the weight, and we want the audience and so on. We have discussed this. We agree. We have lots of problems. And despite we are not commercialized, we don't need the money, still we want to reach out. And it's always a problem. I must say too, I think we are very much, when you talk about young people and women more willing to change, I would say it's about things like this too. We are used to do it the same way. What's news? We know what news is in the newsroom. It's hard. We discuss this and we don't succeed. I agree with you, but I don't have a better answer, unfortunately. Maybe constructive journalism will be one way of reaching out in new areas. I hope.
I was just
It's not a very good answer, but that's the only answer I can give.
I just saw Celia putting on the camera, and I was Celia, you work for the YLE in Finland. Would you want to react?
Yeah, no. Well, I don't think I have any better answer either. It's a very complicated issue for sure, but I just think it's fantastic that people have been putting so much effort to bring up more conversation about it and to actually have research about it. And I think that's a very good start. And I believe we could have, just the other day I was thinking that maybe we could have a bit more collaboration between different sort of types of conciliatory journalism or between journalists from different companies and different institutions, also researchers from universities. I think that would be very, very fruitful. So thanks, everybody.
Yes, I think that it's not difficult to find journalists who are interested in these kind of ideas and even the term social responsibility. But the way I've experienced it is that journalists want to find these things themselves rather than ascribe to a movement, so to say. So everybody wants to come up with the same ideas on their own. Maybe Torbjörn, you had a raised hand first, and then Catherine after that.
Yes, actually I was going to refer to Catherine in my little remark, because some earlier time when you spoke, you mentioned a common book by Peter Bro, Danish researcher, about different ways during the last century to reform journalism from within. And maybe we should have a new discussion in the autumn when we all have read that book and try to draw conclusions from it. And what we can see is the common part in these efforts. And I also had a thought about these different public journalism, civic journalism. So there was this big effort in the United States by Bill Kovac and Tom Rosenstiel to visit different, all over the country, Federation journalists, and talk about problems. And that in the end ended up in their book about the elements of journalism, which they have revised 4 times and added to the new development of digital journalism. But would you consider them to be a part of these kind of different ways to enrich, to reform journalism? They does not call themselves anything other than journalists, but they have defined 10 principles that they think should be a part of journalism.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'd have to look at those 10 principles before I could really answer that. Maybe they're an example of what we're talking about. That's just better journalism without a term.
Now 2 more raised hands, and we have a few more minutes left. So Catherine, please, and then Cecilia.
Such a rich discussion. I'm really enjoying this. I just wanted to quickly say to Cecilia and Celia, I think both of your broadcasters are working with this in different pockets of this organization. So I think you're doing better work in Sweden and Finland and in some of the Scandinavian countries than elsewhere. So thank you so much for that. But I also wanted to say to Torbjørn, maybe in 10 years' time or in 20 years' time, we will be able to see how social media and the consumption of content there might affect news values. I'm curious to explore more along the lines that Karen mentioned, that young people would like to see this more. So maybe there's a potential in doing stories or content on the social media channels where they are that has more of these elements in them. Personally, I'm starting a project up in this autumn, trying to test some of these ideas on social media channels. It's taken me a while because I had to take away my own values as a TV and radio reporter and going into this very small and quick narrative that exists on social media, but it's going to be interesting to see. So maybe that will happen. And my last comment was just in the chat. Emily, a colleague from Canada, just wrote that she has done interesting research looking at how constructive journalism and its cousins are used covering Indigenous people. And diversity, I think, diversity issues. That's very, very interesting because that's really fantastic work. I'm gonna read that article and write something about it, because we, of course, have Greenland here with Indigenous people that could be covered much better than it is.
Yeah, it's seen as, from my understanding, from what I know so far, as a way to connect with those communities that were really harmed by previous media coverage throughout colonialism in Canada. So you cannot repair this relationship easily because it's been broken over and over. But one of the ways that newsrooms are trying to do this is through social journalism and a more positive way to connect with those communities in the news. Yeah.
I'd encourage you both to look at solidarity journalism. I'll drop a link in the chat right now, but that again is a way to report more responsibly on marginalized communities that might be useful there.
All right, thanks. Now we have great stuff also in the chat, and we've had a great discussion, and things are kind of, I've found this evening very inspiring. And now we have one more minute, or maybe a couple of minutes more. I'd like Laura and Karen to close the discussion. What have you kind of picked up from this? What kind of feelings, and maybe look to the future? Catherine asked about where to now, kind of a question. We've talked about how these different forms of socially responsible journalism stem from different kinds of needs. Do you see something like that emerging next, something journalism or whatever? But please, closing words from you too.
For my part, first of all, I'd like to thank, I think also this has been great. I lost a bit my focus a bit when my son appeared in the room, so I've been trying to refocus back to the discussion. But like I mentioned, I might be personally more interested in trying to work with the theory part of it all in the future. And in the pipeline, Catherine was asking, I have an accepted paper not yet published in a Routledge Companion to News and Journalism. That's a huge book coming out this year. And I can just put the title of the paper. It's basically just very basic summary of these various journalisms from the viewpoint of polarization. It looks very simple, the paper, I just read it, but oh my God, how much work I put in, and my brain was, bursting. But this kind of exchange, of course, helps to clarify one's thoughts and gives you inspiration. So thanks for that.
Laura, I'm so glad you want to work more on the theory because I think that's needed. So thank you for your work on that. And I'm not sure if you've seen Catherine Thier has done a paper. I don't think that's been published yet. I think right now it's just a conference paper form, but it's offering some theoretical frameworks that we can use for this work. So you might be interested to know that. As far as my future work on this, two things. So recently Kaiser, Lowe, and I did a couple systematic reviews looking at where we're at in the realm of solutions and constructive journalism research. And when we looked at the effects of these approaches, we found that there's not been a lot of experimental research looking at the effects of these approaches on trust in journalism. And I find that at the same time, people talk a lot about how these forms can help improve public trust in the media. But I see the evidence for that lacking. So I think more research about how socially responsible journalism, or how it might impact or increase public trust in the media, is an area I want to go. And then also, I'm really interested in constructive and solutions journalism in developing democracies and what it means. Specifically, I study journalism in East Africa, mostly in Rwanda and Uganda and Kenya. And, you know, how do they, what does it mean to them? And kind of those blurred lines of practicing constructive journalism in a way that's not just towing the government's line and kind of an excuse to promote propaganda, but rather, you know, can they do it in a way that's not promoting the government, and just what do they think of it? So those are kind of the two areas that I'm interested in moving forward.